we'll look at why the Queensland Premier's first vaccine has proved so divisive online. Joining me on the panel tonight, Executive Director of New Narratives, a not-for-profit that aims to support independent journalism in the Global South. Prue Clark, lovely to see you in person.
Thank you.
We also have tonight the Co-Director of the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney, Ian Hickey. Now, in Melbourne, Chief Executive of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Paul Guerra, you look like you're right in the middle of the city, but you're wearing boxers in your back room, aren't you?
No truth to that, but I'm not in the middle of the city, no.
You're at home, you're at home. And in Cairns, Managing Director at 15 Times Better, an organisation that aims to scale and deliver Indigenous affairs programs, Topaz McAuliffe. Hi, Topaz in Cairns.
Hi, Ellen, how are you?
Jealous. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. Unfortunately, Victoria's COVID count is still heading in the wrong direction, with 11 new cases recorded in the past 24 hours, including 3 children. But according to authorities, these latest numbers aren't quite as troubling as they might appear.
24 hours ago, we had 2 positive cases. And, I think as a community, you kind of go, well, that feels a lot better than the 11 we're reporting today. You scratch the surface of the 11, you work out that 9 of them, or 8 of them were completely isolating and quarantining during their period. 1 was already isolating for most of their infectious period. You got 2 new cases, so it's a different dynamic.
It's more than pain. It is supremely challenging for businesses to survive with what lockdown does. That is part of the broader considerations of Cabinet in speaking to those sectors and all of the stakeholder groups.
The economic impact of this 4th lockdown is estimated to be in the order of $2 billion, and while the state and federal governments are offering financial relief in the form of grants and one-off payments, there are concerns that eligibility rules and wait times are leaving people wanting. And data from Services Australia shows that many are turning to JobSeeker and youth allowance. In the fortnight since the statewide lockdown began, there has been a 62% jump in Victorian applicants. And we'll go to the Victorian on the panel in just a moment. Let's start with you, Ian. Last August you were in at the height of Victoria's last lockdown, and you said that JobKeeper was actually the most important mental health program in Australia. Is what is unfolding in Victoria today bearing that out?
Absolutely. Being tied not just to income, being tied to work, your work relationships, your community, your sense of identity is critical. I mean, the pandemic continues worldwide, and in Australia, although we've hoped continuously we would be out of it, we're not. As the unfortunate situation in Victoria now demonstrates, it continues. So JobKeeper is quite different to JobSeeker. It's actually maintaining the continuity of who you are, where you are, and from a community point of view, we made the point, it's the most important mental health program, along with the most important economic program.
Because the money was going, the wage subsidy was going to your employer, who was paying it to you, and therefore those ties that bind.
Kept you connected, kept communities connected. You were not out looking for a new job, which you obviously can't do in Victoria at the moment.
Right.
You actually stayed connected, and that's staying connected. In fact, the Prime Minister made the comment himself, and modelling that we've done, it probably saved 500 lives. Actually, it is the most important program. So it's not just the economics of it, it's the connectivity of it and staying connected. So we thought we're at the view you wouldn't rush to take it away while the pandemic was what it was. And as we've seen with the pace of the vaccination rollout, with the difference in quarantine, we in Australia, although we've been very fortunate to this point, cannot take our good fortune for granted.
And when you say saved Australian lives, 500 lives?
Lives that would have been otherwise lost over the course of the pandemic through suicide and related mental health deaths.
Gosh.
That actually, when we talk about what it costs, there's the economic cost, there's the social cost, but on the health side, there's not just what happens as a direct consequence of the virus, what else would happen. And the Prime Minister was quite happy to pick that up as saying, look, that is the actual benefit. That's why we do it, economically, socially and personally. In this situation, what we see is the ongoing situation, and we've seen last week, I think, in the public reaction to the Commonwealth's slowness to actually provide economic support. A lot of people had used up their sick leave, they'd used up their assets. But really importantly, they lost their connection through casual work, through other work, through the potential, as we've seen in the lockdown, now for the 4th time in Victoria. And we saw already last year in Victoria the mental health consequences in the second prolonged lockdown. That while there are issues nationally in the mental health space, they were exacerbated in Victoria, but we had really good government programs, principally JobKeeper. JobSeeker, the supplement being increased, but also support for rental accommodation, for staying, for not foreclosing on mortgages, a whole range of programs that gave action to the words, we're all in this together.
Paul, we've got you back now. Take some time to talk to us about how this fourth lockdown is different for people in Victoria.
Yeah, it's been really tough. There's a lot of trauma out there, and it's bringing back the memories of where we went through for the bulk of last year. There's a lot less financial reserves, particularly in those small to medium business. And of course, as Ian was talking about, the support mechanisms aren't there in the same way. There's the yo-yoing in and out of confidence, of contact tracing. One day we're confident, next day we're not. There's some industries that are open, and whilst that's good for those industries, there's also the other industries saying, well, how come they're open and I can't be open? But I think the overarching view is, why does that keep happening to Victoria? Why do we keep ending up back here when the other states seem to be able to manage much better than what we do?
Okay, and does that extend to the question being asked about whether it's proportionate? Because in Victoria you're allowed to ask that question, whereas Victorians get pretty upset when people outside start to ask that question. So you can go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, and that's living the reality of the situation. The whole state is locked down for, in most days it's been a handful of cases. Today there was 11, as you say, but even the 11, they were all in isolation. So there is a sense in some parts that we have got our arms around it. In other parts, clearly there's still a concern as to how much our arms are actually around it. So, and that's what businesses have been speaking to me about, and we've been speaking to the state about. Is this, the lockdown, has it been proportionate to the risk that's actually there? And great, regional Victoria has now moved ahead. Metro's still in lockdown. When does Metro come out of lockdown, and when does the lockdown start to become proportionate? I guess ultimately we just want to be open again to enable people to get back to some kind of life.
Topaz, you've been an advisor to business for years and years now. One of the things that people talk about is kind of no clear benchmarks on, what happens across various states when A happens or B happens or C happens. Is that part of the issue here?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if businesses haven't got any certainty around guidelines in terms of the pandemic, obviously it's been a couple of years now, and every time this lockdown has happened, we seem to respond, I'd say, sort of reactively to it. Businesses having uncertainty around, well, what does it mean when I have to start considering closing, but also what does it mean when I can actually start to look opening again? And so that lack of, permanency or decision-making affects often the more marginalised workforce and industries, which are largely casualised as well. So that impact is flowing on, I think, into groups that will find it far harder to actually get back from what the pandemic's effects are.
Prue, I want you to have a look at this. Anastasia Palaszczuk is the latest state premier to roll up her sleeve for a COVID-19 vaccine, but she's faced criticism after posting this tweet.
Today I got the Pfizer vaccine. In the event, I need to travel to Tokyo for the Olympics.
Now, Ms Palaszczuk is 51 years young and therefore should have received an AstraZeneca vaccine, but the wait time between doses for the AZ is 12 weeks, which would mean she wouldn't be fully inoculated should she end up going to Tokyo. It's worth mentioning that a recent survey by Queensland Health found that 40% of the state's residents were unlikely to get vaccinated because of concerns about side effects. But that hesitancy might be waning. Over the past week, more than 140,000 people in Queensland received a dose. Now, you're interesting, Prue, an Australian who's lived for so long in New York and quite recently, as well as London. What is your perspective when you see, I've got it written down here somewhere in one of these notes, I think Anastasia Palaszczuk has been eligible for that shot since, it might even be worth looking up, I think the end of late March? And there's a list in the newspaper of which Premier and state leader got their vaccine when.
I got to say, so much of this has been just confounding to my New York friends. And it just adds to the mixed messaging that is being sent out that he's going to be problematic long term. If the Premier wasn't willing to take AstraZeneca, what does that say to everybody else when we already know that there is going to be hesitancy, there are going to be hesitancy issues? But, I think looking at it from the perspective of having been back for 2 years, it does feel like finally we're building maybe to a climax. You know, businesses are starting to get very angry. Melburnians who were incredibly tolerant for so long are starting to say, we've run out of patience as well. Strangely, there still doesn't seem to be a whole lot of sympathy for the tens of thousands of Australians who've been trapped overseas. But it feels like the government worked so hard to construct a narrative that Australians believed and took to heart at huge numbers that we need to go for the elimination strategy. 70 to 80% of Australians still support that. But we're getting closer and closer to a stage where the government's really going to have to change that narrative and convince the Australian population that we can live with some virus. You know, as this takes off across the world, my friends in America and Europe are travelling, they're going back to school in the fall, life will go on and we'll still be locked down. This seems untenable.
Topaz, give me the vibe in Queensland. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, Anastasia Palaszczuk and her Chief Health Officer, Dr Young, said that they wouldn't be having the vaccine. Palaszczuk said she wanted to have the flu shot first. I think the words were that, you know, it sort of wasn't their turn. Did that create a sense among Queenslanders that, you know, there was no real urgency to getting this done?
Yeah, and obviously most people have experienced the laid-back nature of Queenslanders as well. And so this just, I think, just the general conversations being had around, you know, the dinner table and at barbecues is very much people have taken a step back around the certainty or the urgency around it. So I immediately thought that everybody would be lining up, but I would say it's actually the opposite around the networks that I've got at the moment.
What are they saying?
They're just really unsure. They're actually just saying we want more evidence as to why we need to be going out and getting it, and nobody's really rushing. There's absolutely a huge push, obviously, especially amongst the Indigenous communities. So I think the messaging that's been out there trying to get everybody to go ahead and do this, some of the actions have actually changed a few people's views, and a lot of uncertainty is the biggest part of it, especially around vaccinations. So yeah, it's been really interesting.
And it was interesting to see there was a big blitz in Queensland over the weekend, but it was in the southeast corner. 17,000 vaccinated in a weekend at these special vaccination hubs, Topaz. Anyone over 40 plus could rock up. Aged care workers, disability workers who'd been let down by the federal contractors, the federal government's contractors, they could turn up as well. And now I read that Queensland's the first state to authorise chemists to vaccinate community members, just like they do with the flu vaccine. And that's designed to get into regional centres. Now, so you're sitting there in Cairns. Have you heard anything about getting the jab at the chemist just like you do for the flu?
No, that's news to me. It's not saying it's out there, but just through your standard networks that I haven't come across that information.
It's a way to go, isn't there, Ian?
A way to go. The states could have done this in the first place. It's interesting what you're saying earlier on. The Commonwealth was not clear about an elimination strategy. The states imposed that. And then there's the idea that each state premier has been able to keep people safe, which has been obviously spectacularly successful politically.
And the commentary on the weekend was that the Prime Minister has now said, all right, well, if that's the successful political commentary, if the rivers... Well, and also if that's what the people want, the river's flowing strongly that way, we'll go that way.
But clearly it creates a whole series of problems. Those overseas, we are going to be part of the international communities, which we should be, we need to be able to function on an ongoing basis. And that clearly means we've been too slow to deliver vaccination. We didn't go for what worked, which is state delivered, but Commonwealth supplied as quickly as possible. And now we find ourselves stuck between. And other countries that were successful for a while have run into the Delta variants, particularly the Delta variant, things take off and they're no longer safe. So the risks we take, the complacency is not just in Queensland, the complacency has been national.
But we do
Victoria's been the problem.
But when you look at those figures that the ABC publishes every day, Ian, about the numbers, you see this spike when Melbourne broke out.
Well,
right?
the reality comes home that actually...
But only in the eastern states, only in the eastern states, not so much in Tasmania, not so much in South Australia, Western Australia and the Northern Territory.
Well, those parts of the country that have been more isolated, like Tasmania, Western Australia, have been able to control it. And Queensland, to a point, when it drew a border and said you could no longer cross it, had been more successful. But the national problem is there. I think what is so missing is a national perspective. That national cabinet thing, we don't really have different health advice in every jurisdiction. The health advice is the health advice. What we really need is national agreement. What is the situation so that we get beyond lockdown as the only strategy on quarantine, on vaccination, on what types of proportionate strategies are really required. And what we have is a lot of politicking, frankly, that has worked variously in different places at different times.
But just a quick one, Paul. Are you thumping the you've had COVID and you've had the vaccine, and presumably the business community, you know, would be tempted to dart us all with rhino guns, just to be quiet about it, to get the whole joint moving. I'm sure they wouldn't. Are you happy with how it's going? Because I'm surprised that we don't know how many AstraZeneca doses we produce in this country every week. We don't know how many Pfizer vaccines come into this country every week, every month. We don't know how much is being supplied to each state and territory each week or month. And given that when I had my jab, bing, I had a new message on MyGov and there it was, all registered, how old I was and all the other things about me, my health record and all the rest. So, but we can't say, oh, all the middle-aged television hosts are getting it, but none of the young 18, right? But that computer can give us that information. It's not even hard.
Yeah, and that's the one advantage that we've seen out of the last Victorian lockdown that we're living through. The vaccination rates have gone through the roof, which is good, because if we want to resume our place in the global economy, we are going to have to be vaccinated, not only to travel, but to accept people coming back in.
But would a bit more transparency and accountability on those issues help? We've got this much, we've used this much, these groups are doing better than others in terms of their willingness to take it up, and therefore we need to work on these individuals or these groups of individuals, these called groups, to get the message across.
There's no question about that. And the more information that can be put out there, the more people can then make their own decision around whether they want the vaccination and then go and do it. You know, we're encouraging people to do it, but I've had enough opportunity to speak with what I'd consider to be experts to consider, you know, the risk of any ramifications low, the benefit of getting the vaccine to be high. And we're encouraging our staff to do it after they've done their own research as well. And we're providing them time off to go and do it should they want to do it. And ultimately, if we want to keep business open, we need more people vaccinated. To keep Australia open and to participate in the global economy, it's get vaccinated and make sure we're doing quarantine properly.
There isn't enough incentive to get vaccinated yet. I mean,
but if everybody wanted to go out tomorrow and get vaccinated, Prue, I'm not certain that we have the supply to do it.
Well, there's absolutely that problem, but you know, it's a perfectly rational decision, I think, not to actually get vaccinated while there are no incentives to do it. It doesn't get you to travel, it doesn't save you from lockdown. And at the same time, you have all of these very legitimate fears about AstraZeneca that have been misinformation to a large extent.
There's not dying part that's good.
You are at more risk, you know, potentially of being exposed to downsides of AstraZeneca, potentially, than getting COVID in most of Australia.
Except
in a lot
that
of
there's been an outbreak out of hotel quarantine once every 12 days in this country for months now. And so we've seen what happened in Thailand. I mean, you'd have to believe that that's possible, right?
You get vaccinations around those locations where people do feel at risk, but you probably don't feel at much risk in far north Queensland or West Australia now.
But I think your point about transparency is critical. Some of us who are cable television sort of addicts, you know, late at night you can watch Public Health England being actually interrogated by parliamentarians. They can tell you exactly where people have been vaccinated, what is happening, and it creates social group pressure. Why aren't you, your particular community, your particular group? What do you understand? And then you can have the targeting about what's the real risk, what can happen, what can't we do as a consequence, what would be the incentives. We don't have that transparency.
Is it supply or demand that's the problem?
And is it really a supply problem? Is really the government reservation is we have a supply problem, not a delivery problem?
We don't know the answers to any of these questions.
We don't get straight answers to how many people have received the first vaccine, how many people are fully vaccinated, where and where they live, what groups they're in. That sort of straightforward information drives social behaviour as to what's really going on. And if certain groups have real reservations in particular areas, they can be addressed. But is it a supply problem as distinct from the delivery sets of issues? Why haven't the degree of disability workers been vaccinated? What has happened in aged care? What are the real situations? When that's being reported, guess what? Behaviour changes a lot.
Well, now, before we move on, I just want to update you with some really disturbing news from Western Australia involving the Tamil family who are being detained on Christmas Island, more commonly known as the Billawheeler family. According to change.org, their youngest daughter, Tharnika, has been medically evacuated to Perth after being hospitalised on Christmas Island with a suspected blood infection. They say the Queensland-born 3-year-old had been unwell for 10 days. Her mother, Priya, is accompanying her to Perth and issued this statement about her child's condition.
I am feeling very scared and worried for my little girl. She has been sick for many days. It took a long time to get her to the hospital. She is already asking for her papa. It's going to be very hard being away from her dad and sister.
For more on this, we're joined in Melbourne by reporter at The Guardian Australia, Josh Taylor, who's been reporting on the family's situation. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Thanks, Mary.
And of course, everyone will know that they're referred to as the Biloela family because the family were much loved when they were living for some years in Biloela in Queensland. There was a huge groundswell of support from that community to bring them home despite 2 deportation orders. They have been on Christmas Island since 2019, which is most of little Tharnika's life. What's happened to her?
She's been feeling unwell for, as you said before, about 10 days. My understanding is that in the last couple of days she's been having quite a bad fever, and she has been having medical care on Christmas Island, but obviously the facilities on Christmas Island are somewhat limited, so they've made the decision that, given that it seems quite serious that she could have septicemia, that they will transfer her to Perth now, and my understanding is she's on a flight at the moment, and then she'll get medical treatment with her mother. But it's not great times for them. And then this is something that we often see come out of, particularly, not that Christmas Island is an offshore detention centre. I mean, it's technically offshore, but we saw cases like this in Nauru and Manus Island as well. That the medical facilities available to people being held in detention is not that great, and they end up needing to be transferred to Australia. That's why we had the Medivac legislation that the government ultimately ended up rolling back. It's why a whole bunch of asylum seekers and refugees were brought to Australia and were kept in hotels for quite a year because they were brought here for medical treatment. So it's not great news, but this is kind of what we've seen in the detention system so far.
I'm just astonished reading through the reporting on this case. During the months that the family were detained in detention in Melbourne after they were moved from Biloela, the children were found to be suffering a vitamin D deficiency because they didn't spend enough time outside in the sun. Tharnika, who's been rushed over to hospital in Perth now, had to have some teeth removed at the age of 2 because they were rotting because she wasn't getting the nutrition that she needed. How does a child go from being unwell, feverish, diarrhoea to septicemia in Australia's care?
Yeah, it's I'm not a medical expert by any means, but it's just horrifying. They are literally the only children being held in detention in Australia at the moment under the government's policy, and it's horrible that the government is still sort of keeping them there. It seems to be a permanent state of limbo just because the legal case is still ongoing, and although the government has sort of made motions around potentially releasing him to the community, it's still very much looks like they're still being detained. I mean, the Nardis and Kopika had to remain on Christmas Island in detention. The family's conditions, they're in sort of a demountable style home. They basically only get to go to certain places under guard. Kopika gets picked up at school by security guards and sort of isn't allowed to go to anything that anyone else on the island does. It's just really horrible treatment.
So on Christmas Island now, where little Tharnika has lived for most of her life, as I say, BBC did some reporting on this, and the cost of detaining her sister and her parents there to May 2021 was running at about $6 million. Under Australia's immigration laws, it is lawful to lock up what are called unlawful non-citizens for indefinite detention. What is the future for this family?
Well, so they had a win in federal court in February, which basically said that the government sort of didn't give them due processing in considering processing Tharnika's visa application. The government didn't actually appeal the decision in that, and my understanding is that it's now before the Immigration Minister, Alex Hawke, to consider whether so there's this bar on preventing people like Tharnika from applying for asylum in Australia, whether to lift that bar or alternatively release the family into community detention. So my understanding that's with the family. If you look at what the government if you look at what the government has been doing in the past couple of months, we've seen a lot of the men who were being held in hotels in Melbourne and Brisbane being let out into the community in community detention. The government kind of realises that this is quite an expensive thing that they're doing, and it's incredibly unpopular, particularly for this family. So I think, the optimist in me says they might end up they might be released into community in Christmas Island, but it's basically sort of just got to play it day by day. It's really hard to predict the government's movements on this.
Meanwhile, we think of that little girl and a mum in hospital in Perth, hopefully getting really good care there. Thanks, Josh, for updating us there. Josh Taylor is a reporter at The Guardian Australia. You're watching The Drum, and with me on the panel are Executive Director of New Narratives, Prue Clark, Co-Director of the Brain and Mind Centre in Sydney, Ian Hickey, in Melbourne, Chief Executive of the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Paul Guerra, and in Cairns, Social Inclusion Specialist, Topaz McAuliffe. It's now almost 15 months since Australia's international borders slammed shut. We know from the federal budget that they are unlikely to reopen for at least a year, and their continued closure is having serious long-term effects on the whole wider economy. There's the drag on industries like tourism and aviation, the cost to universities, and the extraordinary shift playing out in our workforce. After peaking in 2015, Australia's skilled migrant intake has fallen steadily since 2017. Have a look at that orange line down the bottom there. It's all falling. At the same time, the number of temporary migrants, predominantly students, have grown. But now, thanks to COVID, our pool of temporary skilled migration and international students has all but dried up. For more on this, we're joined from Canberra by Special Advisor for Strategic Communications firm Michelson Alexander and former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration, Dr. Abul Rizvi. Thanks so much for joining us, Abul.
Hi, Ellen.
This is a conversation that we've been having over and over again, and reports keep coming out, and there's this kind of dawning realisation about what's happening in Australia. Migration is big. More than 1 in 4 people in Australia aged in their 20s and 30s arrived here in the past 2 decades. Who are all these young people, Abul, and where did they come from?
Well, actually, the vast majority of them are either students or working holiday makers, many of whom have gone on to secure permanent migration. That's been the big story in Australia's migration for the last 20 years.
So we've got this notion of people coming out over with, fully fledged bachelor degrees and all the rest of it in suits, but actually they are students that we managed to hang on to after they come out of universities. Is that it?
That's exactly right. In the early 2000s, when the Howard government wanted to increase immigration, we were unable to secure enough skilled migrants through the traditional means of recruiting them from overseas. So we moved into recruiting them as students and working holiday makers, encouraging them to acquire the skills needed to meet our skill standards, and then to become permanent residents on that basis.
And so this whole idea that international students come to this country and we say, but you've got to go home. Come in here, give us your money, give Ian's university your money, and then off you pop. That's not how it goes at all, is that right?
Well, the official policy is, and it's been the official policy for an extensive period, other than a period between 2001 and 2008, that an immigration officer could refuse a student visa application if they suspected the student of harbouring thoughts of becoming a permanent resident of Australia.
So if they looked deep into their soul and thought, you want to stay, they could flick them out. But now we've realised that's quite the opposite of what we want to do. We want to hang on to them.
I think that's where a problem lies. On the one hand, the government knows that that is the case, but it won't explicitly change policy to make it transparent that that is the case.
OK, and then the next point that we've been talking about is who knew that the numbers of temporary migrants were so high? 1.25 million people in 2020 were temporary skilled migrants, and that number increases 50,000 a year over the past decade. So increased 50,000, 50,000, 50,000. Now, I was telling you earlier, Abul, that my husband and I went on our wedding anniversary dinner last night to a restaurant, and it was a catastrophe. The dinner didn't come for an hour and a half. We tried to leave the restaurant quite politely at the end of dinner, still slightly hungry, but we'd given it up for all. We've been married a long time. We can weather this. It's fine. It's 18 years. It's fine. But we were actually pinned behind the table by them saying, no, we've got to clear the table before you can leave. And I think that the problem is that all the temporary migrants went home. Is that the problem?
Well, a lot did go home, but in all, there's still something like 1.7 million temporary migrants in Australia.
Well,
that
they weren't in that
Zealand
restaurant
citizens.
last night, let me tell you. No one was in the
fair
kitchen.
enough, I can't vouch for that particular restaurant.
It was a shocker. Let me just remind you of what Scott Morrison said when he was asked whether or not this group, this huge group, of 1.25 million people who are in the country every year. The numbers increase by 50,000 every year. They're temporary migrants. They include those students who wait tables. They include the people who are in the restaurant kitchen and all the rest of it. When he was asked, should we try and hang on to these people, these potential future migrants, these critical workers, should we pay them JobKeeper and JobSeeker? This is what he said.
For those backpackers in Australia who are nurses or doctors or have other critical skills that can really help us during this crisis, then there'll be opportunities for them as well. But our focus and our priority is on supporting Australians and Australian residents with the economic supports that are available. As much as it's lovely to have visitors to Australia in good times, at times like this, if you're a visitor in this country, it is time, as it has been now for some while, and I know many visitors have, to make your way home.
Okay, well, so the message was go home. Just briefly, what are the implications for getting enough permanent skilled migrants in this country from that message?
Well, it certainly soiled our reputation as a welcoming country. It certainly soiled our reputation in terms of the international education industry and as a tourism industry in terms of working holiday makers, etc. But having said that, the Prime Minister has in recent months completely backflipped on that message. He has said on a number of occasions now that he wants to change things so that we can increase the level of migration, both temporary and permanent, such that for this year and next year we have significant levels of negative net migration. And then for 2 to 3 years after that, the Treasury is forecasting the steepest rise in net migration in our history, levelling off at a level of 235,000 per annum, a level significantly above that forecast by, for the long term, forecast by Joe Hockey's intergenerational report in 2015.
So that's massive
which was itself yes,
massive.
Which is itself significantly higher than what Wayne Swan forecast when Kevin Rudd was talking about a big Australia. So we are now talking about levels that are unprecedented.
Yeah, there's not a big Australia, this is a huge Australia. Prue, take the time to tell me your story. We are trying to get skilled people into this country. What happened when you came back here with your skilled husband and children in tow?
Well, this is, incredibly good news, and I hope that people, Australians in future, find it more welcoming than we have. So we have, I've been overseas for 19 years. I went around the world, gained skills. I got an Ivy League degree, met an American bloke. That happens. He also has an Ivy League degree, very expensive, that the Australian government didn't have to pay for. 2 Australian children, 18 years of marriage. In fact, we got married here. And then when we decided to come back, it has taken Eric 23 months to get his permanent residence visa. 23 months of extraordinary uncertainty for our family, inability to have many jobs that require a permanent resident visa. We weren't able to get a mortgage. There were probably other things we weren't able to do. And by chance, we actually had a comparison, having done this same process in the UK and the US, and in both cases, we received the same amount of rights in 2 months versus 23 months. Now, I know it's the pandemic, and I'm assuming that has had some impact, but the immigration authorities are impenetrable. We were unable to get any real answers that whole time. And, there were moments in that 23 months where, had we been offered a job somewhere else, it would have made more sense for our family to take that.
Leave the country.
To leave, because we had no certainty. And I Eric, just so you know, he's spent 25 years as a senior executive with global companies. So, he has, I think, skills and contacts to add to Australia.
Paul, that seems extraordinary. What skills gaps are you seeing showing up while people like Prue and her husband are knocking on the door?
It does seem extraordinary, and there's skills gaps across the board from, as you experienced, the hospitality sector, and we've noticed, particularly after the long lockdown, that a lot of people have left the hospitality sector to go for work in industries that aren't going to be shut down. So think construction and manufacturing, and that's increased today. IT skills are in short supply. We know accountants, those not only graduating, but those that have graduated for a period, they're in short supply as well. And media and comms, we're starting to see shortages in as well. But across the board, we are seeing skill shortages in almost every industry, all the way down to the fruit harvesting, so the fruit picking that we see, that we know is seasonal, but that raises a real issue in terms of what's going to confront us in the not too distant future. It talks to what was spoken about before, the need for international students to come back, because not only did they bring money in terms of supporting the university, but they bring employment with them. And these are the people that traditionally will do the part-time roles, and then, if they're lucky enough, stay in country to use their skills in the careers that they've chosen.
And typically, they don't have dependents that they're bringing with them. They've got an undergraduate or a postgraduate degree, and they come to the country as taxpayers, young, healthy taxpayers. Ian, why would anyone from overseas looking at the option to study internationally want to come to Sydney University or any other university in Australia when they can't be sure that they can come and go back home with the international borders? They can't be sure they can even get here.
It was a huge problem before. We should have been more welcoming. Of course, it's a pathway to permanent residency for a significant number, or even if they don't, to be welcome here and then when you go home to form networks, friendships, relationships, others that last, for investment, for security, participation in the national economy. That should have been before. Now we're in a really difficult situation because we appear particularly unfriendly and other countries are opening up again. So those who would have come to Australia are now seriously thinking Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom. They will go there. These are some of the smartest kids from around the world. They go healthy, they pay, they stay, they form relationships, they contribute to make those smarter, wealthier countries. So we've got to find a way forward. In fact, Gladys Berejiklian here in New South Wales has been very clear. Refloating the university sector isn't just for the straight economic dollars to the universities. It's for the whole economy. And it's for the future society that we want to be part of the Asia Pacific, to be part of international networks. So this is another one where a national plan needs to be very clearly articulated. And there are possibilities of having people vaccinated overseas, of preferentially being people in, not just being fearful. Oh my God, those people from China might bring the virus, or those people from India might bring the virus. Actually, how to manage that can be managed, and it's critical to our future economic and social welfare.
But Topaz, Ian, Abul's made that point about that massive increase in permanent migration to 235,000. Remember we had a debate about 190,000 was too much, and we knocked that back to 160,000. And now we're talking about supercharging it to 235,000 people a year once this is over to meet these really ambitious economic growth targets. The only way you can get, whatever it is, 4% growth or whatever it is, 4.25% growth 2021-22 is, off the back of massive immigration. And while you hope that international students will stay, or 25% of them will stay, while they're studying, they're competing with low-skilled people for work. So what do we need to do to safeguard those low-skilled Australians if we're going to massively ramp up the number of foreign students feeding into that skilled migration program?
Yes, I think, again, it's decisions being made in isolation. So I think there needs to be an overlay with industry and government, because the benefit, not just from having a diverse workforce from all of these skills coming into the country, the economic benefit from our skilled immigrants is just huge. And I don't actually think it's that there's not enough work or employment or opportunities. I do think there's a slight disconnect, though, in terms of some companies have all got appetite and ambition to be able to support skilled workers and migrants. But they do need a bit of help of understanding, well, what is the best way to do that? Do we actually understand what our skilled workforce looks like from a migrant perspective? But also then that holistic approach of what are the impacts of a behaviour now in terms of 10 years' time. And so I think our local Australian workforce also, there is a slight disconnect. So a lot of the solutions that are being rolled out in terms of skilled government programs are not in collaboration with industry enough. So I think that a lot of the investment is going into individuals, but not in partnership with the organisations and companies that actually have the jobs.
And so how
I think if we were able to...
go on.
if we're able to actually bring that a bit closer, for me, obviously, you know, taking away all the complexity, there are so many jobs out there that are available, but there are people who are a little bit unsure of how to access them or get access to them. And so you're often diverted to programs and support with your, you know, job agencies. But the reality is that I think if we removed some of those steps in between and actually you've got an individual who wants to work and you've got a job and, you know, geographically it works, that's what I've seen. It has worked, but I think there's just a lot of noise around it at the moment. And I'm a little bit afraid of what 10 years looks like if we cut ourselves off, especially to international students, knowing the skill shortages we've got at the moment. And if we become a very unattractive country, then we're going to lose a lot more, you know, than some of the entry-level jobs that are also being taken by skilled workers.
What is our reputation, Prue?
So it's interesting. I was actually a professor at a university in New York during the Trump administration when he was very, very nasty to international students, and there was a huge concern in the education sector in America that they were going to lose international students. A lot of my foreign students at the time were very interested in Australia. So I think there is a moment for us to capitalise on the negative sentiment in America, but now we're going to squander that, I fear.
And what's our reputation, though? So, what sort of country are we seen as?
So, I think people don't quite understand the cumulative effect of our climate policy, reputation for the way we've treated refugees, the First Nations Australians. I mean, I was in an event, I think it was Ladysmith Black Mombasa, the South African group, playing at a theatre in Broadway about 10 years ago. And one of the, Hugh Masekela, the very famous South African guitarist, got up at the front and said that he'd been to Kalgoorlie and seen First Nations people treated worse there than people had been treated under apartheid. Shocking. And, you know, thousands of audience members are hearing that every night.
Referencing Western Australia on Broadway. And so if you're an innovative, creative person, is Australia seen as I mean, that's a huge generalisation, but among young people that you met, is Australia seen as the destination for you?
I don't think that Australia is projecting an image of being welcoming to innovation and creativity, and, you know, in the same way that Berlin, New York, San Francisco are. No.
Can I say, we've got to do both things. Young Australians need to do what Prue did. They need to go overseas, be part of global communities, make networks to succeed. And young people from overseas have to be welcome here to do the same, where they stay or they don't.
Isn't that interesting?
Because there's got to be two-way.
One way is very natural. And the other
we need
way
both ways. We can't be seen to be just run by old white guys who don't really bit afraid of the world. We actually got to have young people can go both ways.
Let me come back to a bull on this. Sorry, Paul, I'll come straight back to you, I promise. Now, the Grattan Institute has identified a significant policy failure in our immigration program, one that Abul Rizvi knows all too well. It's known as the Business Investment and Innovation Program. The marvellously named BIP was introduced in 2012 and is designed to select migrants who have a demonstrated history of success or talent in innovation, investment and business, who have anywhere from $200,000 to $5 million to invest. Here's how that's working. Across the board, the permanent visa applications are falling, except when it comes to so-called BIPs, which you can see here in orange. They're increasing. Here they are in orange again. You can see there on the left, they are significantly older than the skilled visa applicants on the right, with the majority of BIPs being in the 35 to 54-year range. And what's more, they actually earn less than skilled migrants by a median average of about $40,000. The data also tells us that BIP visa holders work less on average and have lower English language skills. So it's a special program that actually manages to attract older, less skilled migrants who earn less, whose family members are far less likely to be employed and who are less likely to speak good English. And according to Grattan, it's costing the economy about $2 billion a year. Abul, it sounds like a buy a visa scheme, is it?
Part of it is a buy a visa scheme. There is two parts to it. There's the investor part of the BIP program, which is, I agree, a buy a visa scheme, and it's the one that's really not performing well. And both the Productivity Commission and the Grattan Institute have rightly recommended it be abolished. The second part of the BIP is actually people who successfully set up a business in Australia. They're usually temporary entrants, some of them may be students, who successfully set up a business in Australia and on the basis of having set up and run a business for a minimum period of time are able to get permanent residence. I think the second group is actually performing quite well. The first group is really where the problems are.
OK, and is it correct to say that from 2012 until about now, because the rules have changed, if you're in the queue, the old rules apply and there's new rules that made it a bit harder, but up until now, and including for those in the queue, in some states, all you've got to do is invest $1.5 million in state government treasury bonds and you get an Australian passport. Is that right, just quickly?
Broadly speaking, yes, that's right.
And once you get that Australian passport, that permanent visa, you can go ahead and liquidate those investments. Is that right?
That's right. After that, you can liquidate those investments, and indeed, you have no reason or necessity to, in fact, even live in Australia. Many of the investors are really just buying a passport just in case, and that's why the figures look like the way they do. Or alternatively, they may be using it as a means of getting their children into Australia to get a cheaper education than they would otherwise if they had to pay full student fees.
Paul, a ridiculous question, but why would we run a program, and admittedly it's been a little bit tightened up, and frankly the mainland Chinese, who have been the main people who've been using this, it just so happens that they're the ones who have been applying under the BIP scheme, are possibly less likely, a bull says, to want to come to Australia anyway, given tensions between these two countries. But nevertheless, why would Australia run a scheme that didn't require people to speak good English, didn't require them to be employed, didn't require them to have their families employed, didn't require them to have an undergraduate degree? It wouldn't matter, I suppose, if they were investing and innovating, but according to the Grattan Institute, we don't need the investment. Superannuation firms are brimming with funds to invest, and it doesn't drive innovation because, as we say, you can just yank your dosh out once you get your passport.
Yeah, I don't know. All I'd hope is that as they come, their families come as well, and that means that we might get future citizens down the track. So,
but according to the Grattan,
70%
70% of the people who come with them who are of working age don't work.
Yeah, and that's, if that's the case, then you'd have to ask the question, why is that program ran? But it does circle back to the point I was going to make before, sticking up for Team Australia. We are still seen as a destination. I think our management of COVID through this has been good, and I think once our universities open up again, then I think we will see the influx of international students again. Okay,
but Abul, if you've got 40,000 people, I think the numbers are, coming in under this scheme. Oh no, let me get this straight.
No, it's 13,000 this year.
But if you look at the numbers of skilled people coming into the country, right, the number of skilled people under a certain skilled migration scheme called skilled independent, the skilled independent stream, which is a points system, has fallen from 40,000 visas a year to about 7,500 visas. So if you're running programs like the BIP, you're crowding out skilled migrants, aren't you?
That's true. So the increase in the BIP has squeezed out the skilled independents, and also the increase in places for partner visas. And I suspect Prue's husband may well have applied for a partner visa, have been increased, mainly because the government had been building up a large backlog of partners, and that's why the processing times had blown out. So the skilled independent has been squeezed by backlog clearance in the BIP and backlog clearance in the partner visa category.
This is quite a lark. Is it well known that you can do this or could do this in Australia?
Well, I was saying to you, the first time I heard about it was when some Americans, probably in their 50s or 60s, said, "Did you know I just have to 150,000 Australian dollars invest in Australia and I can get citizenship in Australia?" And they were all like, they were ecstatic. They were going to live in Cairns for 6 months of the year. So yeah, it doesn't make sense, does it? You'd think there would be better ways, more effective ways of spending that money.
Yeah, and there's an opportunity cost, of course, Topaz, of not having those skilled migrants, which I think Grattan has calculated in the billions of dollars. What's a better way to drive innovation? Question to you and to Ian. Start with you, Topaz.
Yeah, so I think one of those things, again, in looking at how do we turn what I guess we've experienced with COVID, there are advantages that should be coming out of this, and we need to start exploring them, especially from a skilled migrant working background as well. And I don't know if I mentioned it before, but, traditionally I think about skilled migrants are 50% more likely to become entrepreneurs and living off a higher median income. And also, generally, some of the businesses that are coming out of it is because they're bringing diversity of thought, and they're often finding gaps in our market and providing solutions for that. So there's just huge benefits all round, I think, by focusing on not just the new workforce to come in, but what is our existing workforce that we've got? Are they underemployed? Can we be looking at this a little bit more differently and really kind of sinking our teeth in to understand what does industry need and what can we be doing together?
Quick final comment from Ian and then a book.
Well, it shows you the fate of individual programs that are over-specified. We had a bigger discussion. What we need is younger people, skilled people having experiences in the country, both skilled, but I must say also the temporary visas who come in and do a lot of other jobs. So we've got a workforce that can actually fulfil our country's needs. That's a bigger level planning exercise. And what's been highlighted by this is when you go for these micro programs, you often stuff it up.
A ball?
I think the crucial thing we've got to do is get the link between overseas students and skilled migrants right. And that means saying if overseas students study in a range of specified areas, the pathway for them to permanent residence should be transparent. It doesn't necessarily have to be rapid, it needs to be transparent. And I think if we can get that right, I think we would be at a substantially more advantageous position compared to other nations in terms of attracting the brightest and the best.
Gee, it's good to talk to you. Thanks so much, Dr. Rizvi.
You're welcome, Ellen.
Abul Rizvi, the former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration. While Australia's vaccination rollout is finally picking up steam, the US has had no such problems. Americans have mobilised to administer close to 300 million doses, with 41% of the population now fully vaccinated. And with such high vaccination rates, many economists thought April would see a surge in the jobs numbers. But in reality, fewer jobs were added than expected. The cause? Well, among other reasons, there's growing research that suggests the pandemic has changed our approach to work. A recent Pew Research study found 66% of unemployed Americans were considering changing their occupations. The data suggests Americans are moving away from environments where they'll be exposed to COVID. For example, grocery stores lost 49,000 workers in April, and aged care homes lost nearly 20,000 employees. Were you surprised by this? Does it portend something more profound in American society, Prue?
Well, let's recognise that economic shocks have the tendency of really furthering currents that were already there. And I think let's start by saying that their job working in those minimum wage jobs in America can be very miserable. They are making $7 an hour, may get 2 weeks vacation a year. They won't often get sick leave, all sorts of things. So the idea that a lot of Americans in those jobs might be thinking differently is not that surprising. But I think, the trends that have already been there have been important. When I first started my non-profit in 2010, I was surrounded in those shared workspaces and cafes in New York by lots of people who were done working 9 to 5, trying to fulfill other people's dreams. They wanted to, I had a friend who started a pickle company that's really successful. And so I think...
Only for people to pick it off.
No, we love our pickles in New York. And they're great. So I think that this is accelerating this trend of people moving into fields that they wanted to do well, or that there were more moving to them, which I think is a good thing. And top of that, the workplace, the workplace setting. A lot of people have been really crying out for more flexibility in the workplace for a long time. Employers are now seeing that it's possible. I mean, the situation used to be, I don't trust you unless I can see you. And very toxic dynamic. So I think that hopefully now that's breaking down. Workplaces are understanding that flexibility is helpful to getting more women into the workforce, perhaps having a better life balance at home, men actually doing more of the parenting and better mental health long term. And thirdly, of course, has been realising that you don't have to take that flight, and that we are going to have to address some very serious questions about climate change and travel down the track. So I think that's going to be important as well, in understanding that we don't actually have to travel as much. And so I think these are all good things.
Topaz, I'm always fascinated by your work. I sort of think of you as a work whisperer. You're this person that connects this wonderful group of people with these jobs, and you kind of explain to the employers how to get the noise out of it and just make it all happen. And when you were at Coles, you were driving extraordinary rates with your team of Indigenous retention in the workplace. Do you think that COVID has reframed what Aussies think is important to do and what purposeful work is?
Yeah, so I think definitely with some of the demographics that are out there and individuals who've stopped and reassessed their working circumstances, Australia does have a reputation for working sort of longer hours. And so I think a lot of people have actually had time to reflect and have recognised that they're just not happy. They're not maybe happy in the actual job that they're doing, not necessarily the type of work, but often the environment that they're working in as well. And so I think watching how companies have handled themselves throughout the pandemic, those that have chosen to try, where possible, look after their team, and have also created environments which allow, you know, to Prue's point, that flexibility around supporting working mothers and working fathers, and, you know, embracing it. And what's happening is those companies are coming out on top in terms of attracting the best talent that's out there, because people value their work-life balance far more than they probably did pre-pandemic, and, you know, for a number of different reasons. Also, I think too, just in terms of the Indigenous employment at Coles, it was this idea that, you know, every Indigenous person should be applying for a job at Coles, but it wasn't actually the case. It's being really transparent about, actually, this is the type of work it is, and does it suit you, and does it suit your family, does it suit your circumstances, and recognising that it's not a one-size-fits-all. It is quite strategic around how you do it. But it's been really interesting watching some of those companies excel, and I don't actually think we've seen the effects of it just yet, because I think there'll be, you know, mass exoduses out of companies when people are able to do that, when choice comes back on the table. And so, yeah, it's been really interesting to watch.
That's, Ian, it's interesting. We're nearly out of time. We've got about 30 seconds, maybe 15 each for you and Paul. But, you know, this value proposition, what's this employee's value to me? And suddenly it's running the other way.
The other way. So people are asking, what is purposeful activity that fits with my life? I think people underrate the degree of social disruption that COVID's going to cause. So people are rethinking, what am I going to do, not just where do I earn a dollar.
Is that a good thing or slightly terrifying, Paul, for business?
The COVID's caused disruption. People are taking the opportunity to move to industries that are more secure, and importantly, there's opportunities to go and retrain, particularly in the digital world, which then gives you a global outlook and a global opportunity as well.
That's right. Once the borders open, Paul, and you can get to a job in Victoria or you can get to a job overseas. Great discussion tonight. Thank you all so much for being with us. And Julia's in tomorrow night. Good night to you all.